All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5. All right. So last week we discussed state-sponsored terrorism, uh, and state-sponsored terrorism is often referred to as terror from above. Right. So the government is above. This week we're going to discuss dissident terrorism, which is referred to as terrorism from below. Okay. So this form of terrorism is committed by non-state movements or groups against governments, against ethno-national groups, religious groups, or other perceived enemies. Okay, this is probably the type of terrorism that most of you are familiar with. You don't hear it called dissident terrorism often, but this is the kind that you hear about most of the time. All right, so those that commit dissident terrorism, or such as revolutionaries, terrorists, assassins, right? They all justify their actions as necessary to defend this higher cause. Okay, so their actions can vary, from large-scale wars to individual assassinations, where they're striking down perceived enemies. These type of terrorists, often cite state-level repression, state-level exploitation, as reasons for their actions. Right, the government is doing things to them. So, as you can probably realize, right, there's so many different kinds, right, of dissident terrorism. You think about all the different groups and all the different governments and all the different situations, right? They're probably innumerable. Okay, so there's quite a few ways that people have tried, to kind of categorize, dissident terrorism, and there's kind of a summary of that in the book. So be sure to read that, be familiar with those. But we're going to talk about, Peter Sederberg again, just like we did, last week. So there's revolutionary, there's nihilist, nationalist, dissident terrorism, and criminal dissident terrorism. Okay, so the goals of revolutionary dissident terrorists are to destroy the existing order through armed conflict and build this well-designed new society. Now, the type of society, will vary based on ideological or religious, nationalist aspirations or other goals. Okay, so kind of depending on who the group is and what they're revolting against, right? That'll kind of decide, what this well-designed new society is. They view the current society as repressive and unjust, and they believe they'll build a just, honest, and progressive society. This type of group doesn't necessarily want a new kind of country identity, but they just want a new society kind of built on the destroyed remnants of the others. So they're going to destroy this other society, then they're going to rebuild on top of it. Nihilism is a belief that only scientific truth can end ignorance. Okay, so they believe, nihilist terrorists believe religious, uh, nationalist, traditional values, especially family values, are the root of all ignorance. They believe the current system is intolerable, um, but they don't really have a plan for what it should be replaced with. So they're not necessarily revolutionaries, um, but some revolutionaries have adopted, this kind of belief system. So the goal of modern nihilist terrorists is simply to destroy the current system through use of arms, but they don't really have a plan for replacing it once they destroy, the system that's there. Because they believe literally anything would be better than what's happening currently. Um, so really, their kind of idea of creating this just society is simply destroy the current one because whatever replaces it can't possibly be as bad as what there is now. So because they don't really have a plan, this type of terrorist or extremist, is even much more on the fringes of society, even kind of among extremists. National dissident terrorism, nationalist dissidents champion the aspirations of groups of people uh, who are distinguished, either culturally, religiously, ethnically, racially. Um, but the goal of nationalist dissidents is to mobilize whatever particular demographic group they're championing against another group or the government. Okay, and what they want is at least some degree of autonomy. Okay, so when you're talking about nationalist dissidents, they may have some religious, they may have some ideological philosophy, but the core of this is ethno-national or some other type of identity. Nationalist dissidents have been using terrorism for a long time, and they're almost always facing this overwhelming military force. So they'd be quickly defeated if they tried conventional warfare. All right. And then the fourth category is criminal terrorism, and I'm not going to really talk about it here because Chapter 9 is dedicated to that form of terrorism. So we'll get to that down the road. So kind of knowing what we know now, it kind of makes you wonder, like, why would a small group choose to confront what appears to be, an insurmountable enemy or an invincible enemy? Okay, well, obviously they believe that their struggle is not in vain, right? They believe that they could actually win, and they think they'll be successful, and they think that victory is inevitable if they can just hold out. Okay, and they believe that whatever their utopian vision not only justifies the means, but also guarantees them victory because they believe that they're just, right? And any kind of just goals or just actions, right, that should guarantee you victory. They also believe that kind of whatever they have to endure kind of presently is fine because of this promised good at the end. So if you mix in some religious, say religious anti-state dissidents, they believe that God assures them of victory. But non-religious anti-state dissidents also believe in inevitable victory. They just don't necessarily believe that God is the one that's going to grant that to them. All right, so we also have dissident terrorism known as communal terrorism. So communal terrorism is group versus group terrorism. Okay, so there's many different types of communal violence in different environments in which it occurs. But there's three kind of broad categories of communal terrorism that we need to discuss. The first is ethno-nationalist communal terrorism, and this is conflict between groups that believes it must defend itself from another group, protect their cultural identity. And sometimes both sides are believing this, right? Both sides are believing they have to defend themselves against the other group to protect their cultural identity. Africa is one of the places where most of this kind of ethno-nationalist communal violence takes place, but it can occur anywhere. But recently, at least, Africa is where most of this has taken place. Religious communal terrorism can also be characterized as sectarian violence, which is a conflict between religious groups and sometimes an element in a broader conflict between ethno-nationalist groups. Okay, so you may already have this ethno-nationalist group conflict, but then sometimes there's a religious component too. And religion plays a role because oftentimes cultural identity is at least partially defined by religious beliefs. So when you have violence, both by and against a group, oftentimes it has both ethnic and cultural and religious, type components. This is really common in regions, that have these long histories of conflict, long histories of conquest, resistance, where you have a lot of different kinds of ethnic groups with differing religious views. Not all of it occurs this way. Sometimes religious communal terrorism is directed against others of the same type religion, against perceived blasphemy or to try to purify a particular religious belief. And then ideological communal terrorism. And since World War II, this was a reflection of the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, so the capitalist democratic West was competing with the authoritarian communist East for influence around the world. And if you look at the different type of conflicts and the groups involved, oftentimes there was a very clear, the East was supporting this and the West was supporting this. And the two ideologies played a strong role in that because the United States and the West the whole time was trying to stop the spread of communism, and the East was trying to spread communism. So you end up with these ideological conflicts with the two big superpowers taking sides. All right, so I need to remember back to where we briefly discussed the new terrorism, how it's changed terrorism. So dissident terrorism has also changed, relative to the new terrorism. Since World War II, the definitions of who enemies are, what are legitimate targets, what are the appropriate means, to attack targets, all those things have changed. Prior to World War II, terrorism was kind of fairly surgical, in where there wasn't any of this kind of broad, attacks or these kind of vague uh, reasonings. Okay, it was specific individuals, specific hostages to kidnap, specific banks to rob. Right, it was very specific in what it was doing. But then in the later part of the 20th century, it became more acceptable to adopt these strategies of kind of indiscriminate killing, not really recognizing differences between combatants and non-combatants, not really recognizing any rules. So then you have kind of this new morality forming. And then, as you remember, right, since World War II, like weaponry has advanced, by leaps and bounds. So you combine this new morality with the advances in weaponry that are out there, and what you have is a prescription for high casualty rates, and you have terror on kind of this unrecognizable scale, or at least the possibility for terrorism on an unrecognizable scale. Two kind of characteristics of the new terrorism that have kind of shown up are cells, cellular structures, and lone wolves. So prior to this, terrorist organizations were pretty clearly organized. They're structured kind of hierarchically. They had these command and control structures. They oftentimes had a above ground political organization, and then they would have an underground, military wing that kind of did their violence for them. But the cellular structure is very different. So with the cellular structure, organizations are much more prone to having kind of an indistinct structure. And cells can be created and cells can disappear almost as quickly as they appeared, and then they can reappear somewhere else. And technology has made this form of terrorism much more efficient, right? Encrypted messages, social media, other forms of communication, right? It makes it much easier for these cells to talk to each other. And it's really, this kind of discussion of cellular structure and kind of this leaderless resistance. Like, it's been around for a while. Louis Beam from the Ku Klux Klan was one of the first ones to start talking about it. And one of the reasons that it started kind of coming around was, it's much easier for law enforcement to infiltrate an actual organization, right? They had a hierarchy and command and control structure. Like, they could find ways to get in there and disrupt the organization. Well, when you have these cells, it's much, much harder to do that, because oftentimes cells don't even know each other, right? So even if law enforcement would take out one cell, these other cells are still operating, and there's not much connecting those two together. Lone wolves are individuals or small groups of individuals, like a wolf pack, that operate without really any clear identifiable association with an actual terrorist organization. Okay, they'll share some ideological views in common, but they're not actually affiliated with them. So technology has also increased, the viability of lone wolves, because the availability of extremist literature and information is now widely available, through the internet and social media. Prior to this technological rise, like, if you wanted to get some white supremacist literature, you'd have to work for it. Like, you'd have to be able to find it. You'd have to get your hands on some kind of newsletter or some kind of publication. Like, it wasn't easy to do. Okay, it could be done, but it wasn't easy to do. Now, right, if you want to read anything, like, you just get online and you can find it. Within a few minutes, you can have and be reading whatever it is that you want to read, and then it makes it much more easier for people to radicalize, and you end up with more of these kind of lone wolves. All right, I'm going to stop there for today. Be sure to complete your assignments. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you next week.